Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's virtual roundtable discussion on a vision for a stronger U.S. Mexico partnership with a focus on emerging opportunities in the automotive industry. Today's discussion is sponsored by the William Davidson Institute and the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan in collaboration with the U.S. Mexico Foundation. My name is Paul Clyde and I am the president of the William Davidson Institute and the Tom Lantos Professor of Business Administration at the Ross School of Business. The two panel discussions you will hear today build on a dialogue started in January of 2020 by a group of 6 former U.S. ambassadors to Mexico and 6 former Mexican ambassadors to the United States. The group came together as part of a joint effort by the U.S. Mexico Foundation and the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute to begin a strategic dialogue on the future of relationships between the United States and Mexico. Today, that conversation continues with a focus on the automotive sector. This topic is very relevant for us at the William Davidson Institute, where our mission is to develop business people and business opportunities in low and middle income countries. Part of our work in the energy sector focuses on energy consumption within transportation. We work to understand and leverage the challenges and opportunities that the transition to electric vehicles is bringing for businesses operating in countries like Mexico. This transition to electric vehicles is the subject of the second panel that will be moderated by Diana Paez, Senior Director at the William Davidson Institute. The shift in energy sources for transportation is just one of many reasons the automotive industry is experiencing dramatic shifts in supply chains more broadly. Given the volume of trade between the United States and Mexico in the automotive sector, automotive is the largest manufacturing sector in Mexico, with about 80% of the automotive production being exported to the United States. There are few places in which the effect of these supply chain shifts will be felt more acutely. That is the subject of the first panel. Francine Lafontaine, the interim dean of the Ross School of Business, William Davidson Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy, Professor of Economics, will moderate the discussion. I will now turn it over to her to introduce her panel and the topic. Dean Lafontaine.
Thank you so much, Paul, for this introduction and for the introduction to the whole event. I am really delighted as interim dean of the Ross School of Business, as well as chair of the board for WDI here at the University of Michigan, to welcome all of you to this set of 2 panels that will explore the relationship between U.S. and Mexico in the automotive industry. I do want to start by thanking all of those that have been involved in organizing this panel, as well as the panelists, for their contributions and for their willingness to share their thoughts. I also want to talk briefly about why it is that we're talking about the automotive industry specifically. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the University of Michigan and with the state and Detroit, for that matter, will understand the close ties that the region and the university have with this industry. A lot of those ties are through the College of Engineering, which is a wonderful set of, which has a number of activities that relate to the industry, including things such as the Automotive Research Center, M-City, and the Ford Robotics Building. And we also have one of our panelists who's an alumni from that school. But part of the goal of this panel is also going to be, or this event more generally, is going to be to show and discuss the much broader set of ties that the university has with the industry, with many faculty members and staff throughout the university and the business school in particular, also working in programs and activities that relate to the industry. This panel is specifically about supply chains and their resilience and the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And this is obviously a very timely topic. For context, let me share a few pieces of information. One is that the United States and Mexico are respectively the 2nd and 6th largest car manufacturers in the world. Mexico also has a very long history of collaboration with the auto industry in the US, going back to 1925 when Ford established an assembly line in Mexico. Ford remains an important, the longest operating automotive industry firm in Mexico, and it continues these activities today, and we are thrilled that we have a member from Ford on the panel. Importantly, also, North American auto production is very integrated, with the supply chains interacting between the two countries in an intertwined way. So this level of integration has grown over time, in part through NAFTA, and now is evolving through the more recent US-Mexico-Canada agreement. But just to give a sense, about 80% of the volume of trade in automotive parts produced by Mexico are exported to the US. And 40% almost of what the US imports comes from Mexico. Obviously, the pandemic in recent times, as well as various major weather events, have affected many industries, and that includes the automotive sector. And these events have also highlighted how interconnected our industries are, and our markets also are vulnerable as a result. So our goal with this panel is to discuss some of the challenges that the industry has faced as a result of these events, but also more generally, how we can bring up opportunities to further collaborate between the two countries and in this industry. So let me now very briefly introduce our panelists, and I will ask for their indulgence as I try to keep the introductions very short to leave the bulk of the time for our conversation. Ambassador Wayne is a distinguished diplomat in residence teaching at American University's School of International Service. He's also a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and co-chair of its Mexico Institute Advisory Board, among many other advisory and board roles. Ambassador Wayne just waved. He has served as a US diplomat for 40 years, including the ambassador to Mexico role from 2011 to 2015. And he was confirmed as a career ambassador, which is the highest rank that's given to a US Foreign Service member, in 2010. Ambassador Gutierrez, which I am not fully pronouncing this correctly, and I apologize for that, is a managing partner at Beal Infrastructure, and which is an advisory and asset management firm based in Mexico City. And he's a senior advisor at Covington and Burling in their Latin America and public policy practices in Washington, D.C. He's also the founder of FMG International. If you could wave Ambassador Gutierrez, that would be wonderful. He has had a distinguished career of more than 20 years with more than 20 years of experience in senior government roles in Mexico in areas such as finance, trade, national security, and so on. He served as Mexico's ambassador to the United States, in particular during the period of negotiation of the new US, Mexico, and Canada trade agreement. Sarah Cartmel will be joining us as well. She is the manager of global government relations at the Ford Motor Company. She joined that team in 2015. She is based in Washington, D.C., and her work focuses on global trade policy and strategy. What this means is that she was intimately involved through the process of the development of the USMCA, and now works with several Ford teams on implementation and implications within the company. She has also worked closely with Ford's European Government Affairs group on issues that occurred as a result of Brexit, and in thinking about Ford's supply chain and manufacturing in the EU and the UK. Prior to Ford, she was at General Electric and also served at the European Commission's delegation to the US. Finally, Oscar Dominguez is joining us. He is president of Lear Mexico Operations and a 34-year veteran of the automotive industry. He began his career as a production supervisor at United Technologies Automotive in Mexico wiring facility and joined Lear nearly 20 years ago as a director of wiring operations in Mexico and has since held several leadership positions around the world in their seating and e-systems operations. Again, thank you, all of you, for joining us for this conversation this afternoon. And welcome. All right, so let me start with a general question, which is to just allow each one of you to talk a little bit about your role very briefly and how it connects to the topic that we are discussing in this panel, which is supply chains and their resilience in the context of Mexico and the US. Let me start with you, Sarah, briefly, and then I'll move on to Oscar and the ambassadors.
Well, thank you, Dean, for the introduction, and thank you to the Institute for the opportunity to be on this panel today. With my fellow esteemed panelists, I am very much looking forward to the discussion and the perspective and insight that they will bring. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm on the government affairs team for Ford in Washington, D.C. So we feel like we are sitting at the center of some of these discussions on supply chain issues. In government affairs, we have sort of a unique role where we engage with the governments directly. So we are external facing, and then we are also internal facing and working with the different Ford teams to understand what can be done, what we should do, where the opportunities lie. You know, I thought maybe I would also just take the opportunity to kind of build on your opening remarks about the integration between US and Mexico in automotive and talk about what that means for Ford specifically. And as you mentioned, we actually were the first automaker to set up shop in Mexico almost 100 years ago now. We have 4 manufacturing facilities in Mexico, vehicle production, engines, and transmissions. And we made about 250,000 vehicles in Mexico in 2019. We made over 2 million in the United States. The bulk of our Mexico production comes north to the United States and to Canada. But we do have some small volume that goes out to the rest of the world, over to Europe or down into South America via other trade agreements that Mexico has. Some of our newest and most exciting product is actually coming out of our Mexican production facilities. The Mustang Mach-E is built in Mexico, along with Maverick, a new small pickup truck, is also being produced down there. On the parts side, you know, the integration is deep and extensive. We buy more than $14 billion worth of goods and services in Mexico each year from more than 500 suppliers in 25 Mexican states. So the ties between Ford and the communities in Mexico are really deep and extensive. For our U.S. built vehicles, you know, Canada obviously is our #1 export market, but Mexico is #2 for us as well. So this automotive integration and the supply chain implications between the 2 countries couldn't be of bigger importance for us and for our work with governments and internally with our teams.
Thank you so much for this perspective. Oscar, may I ask you to say a few words on this?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. It is an honor to participate in this panel. Lear is a global automobile supplier, leader in complete automobile seat systems and a fully integrated and experienced supplier across electrical distribution and connection systems, electronics, and connected systems. We design, engineer, and manufacture world-class products for 400+ vehicle nameplates. Lear has 251 facilities in 38 countries with 175,000 employees globally. My current role is to oversee the Mexico and Honduras operations, where we have 46 manufacturing facilities and over 62,000 employees. In these manufacturing facilities, every day we produce and deliver thousands of parts to support vehicle production in 50+ vehicle assembly plants in the USMCA region. Many of these parts are delivered just in time as the vehicles are being assembled in the production lines. So as you can see, supply chain is a fundamental element in our operations.
Great. Thank you so much. Ambassador Wayne, a few words on this?
Well, certainly I paid a lot of attention to supply chains when I was ambassador in Mexico. And since, in working at the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center, we've worked very hard on trade between the three countries, actually, of North America, including through the whole negotiation of what is now the Mexico-US-Canada Agreement, or US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or TMEC, is it's known in Mexico. And what the key thing, of course, is that we're now in a period of great transition. We're both applying our new trade agreement going forward, and we're trying to learn the lessons of the pandemic. And for the auto industry, you're starting on a large transformation to an industry that will have more electric vehicles in it and will be constantly incorporating new technology. And so what this means is what happens along the border in this very integrated industry is going to be very important. And just to put it in context, there before the pandemic, there's $1 million a minute in trade across that border, and we're moving right back to those numbers now, at least in value of goods that are going back and forth. And that is going to take a lot of collaboration to sustain those flows and to adapt to the changes that are coming. So I look forward to talking about that with my other panel members.
Wonderful. Ambassador Gutierrez.
Thank you very much, Dean LaFontaine. Good afternoon to all. I want to first thank you for the invitation to be with all of you this afternoon. I very much appreciate the opportunity. I also want to commend the William Davidson Institute, the Michigan's Ross School, and the U.S. Mexico Foundation for putting this panel together on an important, on a topic that I believe is extremely important for the economic future of our countries and for North America. My link to today's topics largely stems from, as it was mentioned, of me having served as ambassador of Mexico to the United States between 2017 and 18, precisely at the time that we were transforming NAFTA into the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. As all of you know, the auto sector is perhaps the quintessential North American industry in many ways and for many people, and I think that that's an accurate description. At least is the one that I often used when I was in public service in all my conversations, and from what I learned, it's certainly the case. I would just say that, you know, as all of you know, last June, roughly after 3 years of negotiations and all sorts of legislative maneuvering, the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement went into effect. My view has been that the final provisions did not leave anybody or everybody fully satisfied, rather. But I think that points to something that conceivably we can say that it reflects that that was the deal feasible and possible at the time, given the context. I think that for some, the USMCA has been described, I've heard some people, but as nothing more than a wash out NAFTA. And for others, I think that it's viewed that as the trade agreement that will right all the wrongs of NAFTA and the World Trade Center. I think that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, as is usually the case. But the most important thing about it, I think, is that it was always thought about an agreement that in a context of, in the present geopolitical context, in the present context of world trade and North America, it was something that would allow us to build, continue to build on our very important supply chains And I think that's a central discussion that is going to take place today. So I'm delighted to be with such a distinguished panel, including obviously my friend and colleague Ambassador Wayne, and I very much look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gutierrez. So with all of this context and statements, I would like to think about very specifically, given the importance of the automotive industry and the supply chains we've just talked about, what would be, I'll say, the top priority that you think the US and Mexican governments need to focus on in order to support the industry? Let me start with you, Ambassador Wayne, on this one, and then I'll go to your colleague and to our industry people after that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for hosting us all together here. I think the first thing to be sure of is getting agreement on the rules and having the rules applied, and that goes back to the USMCA. And there's a lot of agreement in many of the areas, but there are some areas where there is not a full agreement. And one of the very important ones for the auto industry is something that's really technical, that's called rules of origin. And how do you apply all the new rules of origin in the USMCA to the auto industry? And there is some serious disagreement that is pitting the United States on one side and Canada and Mexico on the other about how you count all those rules. And it's really important because it's what makes a North American car that doesn't have tariffs applied to it. So I'll leave, that's one area. Another area of the rules that's very important is, are you treating the companies from all three of the governments of the countries equally? And there's some temptation, I would say, in the United States and in Mexico to have reforms and policies that would favor their companies over the companies from the other country in a couple of sectors. So we'll get to look at that. And then the other big thing I think that's important are sort of the areas of cooperation that can really help us come back from this pandemic better. And we can talk about that in more detail, but there's a new U.S.-Mexico forum that's been revitalized called the High-Level Economic Dialogue. And the idea of this forum is for the governments to work with the private sector and with others to build back better on supply chains, really important. What are the problems we discovered during the pandemic in the supply chains? Start modernizing the border again, processes and infrastructure that really got stopped over the past 4 years. Again, very important given all that stuff that goes back and forth across the border, some of it several times in the production process. And then also there's a few other parts of this that we can talk about as we go forward, but one is about all the internet and cyber connectivity. That's going to be really important for the future of the auto industry, with more connectivity becoming very important. Also workforce development, because you're going to be using a lot more technology in producing the future cars, and especially if we get into electric vehicle cars. And so you need to be able to train people well to be prepared for that future. And there are a number of other things that we can explore as we go forward. So, but I think these are the two big priority areas: getting the rules right, and then getting the additional cooperation right that's going to help us move out of the pandemic.
So,
industry.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Wayne. Ambassador Gutirez, could I?
Sure. I will just dovetail on some.
I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. As it often happens, I end up myself almost fully agreeing with Ambassador Wayne, so and he making my life a little bit more miserable because he had said most of the relevant points. So let me just add I couldn't agree more. The first thing we have to address the elephant on the room, which is the rules of origin, and that's a process that's ongoing. and that will, unless it's resolved intelligently and fairly, will certainly jeopardize, in my view, the North American auto industry, and that's number one, clearly. In addition to what Ambassador Wayne said, I wanted, I was very pleasantly and gladly surprised when I saw and I read a letter from President López Obrador to President Biden, if I'm not mistaken, and also in several of his press conferences that, as you know, take place on a daily basis, talk about supply chains in North America. It was quite something for me. But what I mean is that you have absolutely the right narrative at very high levels of government on both sides, certainly on Mexico, about the importance of supply chains and about the importance of the auto industry. But my point is, we need to make sure that we sort of, we have the recipe, but we need to, make sure that the ingredients are there. And that is precisely, I think, the point that Ambassador Wayne is making about the business climate in Mexico. I think we need to improve our business climate. People and businesses expect not only to have our, governments the right narrative, but actually to have the appropriate policies domestically that are conducive to the strengthening of these supply chains. And I think that's a key point that needs to take place and there are several aspects to that. I think one of them is that if you see our trade is our trade diminished as it was naturally during the pandemic. It has very clearly picked up, and hopefully we will find ourselves very soon at levels that far surpass the pre-pandemic levels of North American trade. And the only way in which we can assure that for industries where supply chains, efficient and timely supply chains are so important as the auto industry will occur, is we also think about the infrastructure that is needed to do that. Companies need to get, I'm not the expert, but I know that in the auto industry, it's often said that any particular car model or North American car model will have passed several times the border before it's actually put on the dealership. And that implies that we need to have certainty, and I can speak for the Mexican side, that we have every single piece of infrastructure, roads, electricity, power, ports of entry that would allow that to happen. And I think that's an area that we must focus on and hopefully gain ground, because if not, it's going to be difficult really to talk about this supply chain efficiency. So I will add that to the mix. And I will ask, if I may, Oscar and Sarah, because that's not an area of expertise of mine, but I've read a lot recently about the importance of the so-called semiconductors and chips for the industry. And all of that I understand so far is that A, they're extremely important, and B, that we need to work together to make sure that we have them. I was also pleased to see Secretary Gutierrez, our Ministry of the Economy, be very much engaged in that topic and talked about cooperation between both countries. I don't know how to do that, but I know that that remains a very important issue for the industry. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oscar, would you want to chime in a little bit?
Sure. For us in the industry, we believe the top priority for these countries to support the supply chain should be in reducing the waiting times in moving parts. Okay, it was already mentioned, if we move parts back and forth multiple times. So I'm going to give you a few examples. Of course, we have to eliminate the congestion on ports by increasing the capacity. Right now, we need a 24/7 work schedule And then later on, the governments need to evaluate what upgrades are required to make them more efficient. It can be work schedules only, it can be infrastructure, systems, processes, and combination of some of those, okay? On the U.S.-Mexico border has close to 1,250 miles of common border. And on a daily basis, about 40 to 45,000 trucks cross that border through 28 different crossing points for commercial vehicles. And what I can tell you is not even one has a normal schedule to operate 24 hours a day. And many of those border crossings not even work 7 days a week. So we have limited schedules that cause supply interruptions, delays, premium costs for the industry to move critical parts, in top of the traffic congestions that people who live on the border are very familiar with on both sides of the border. So we need both governments to open some key border crossing points to operate 24 hours, 7 days a week for commercial vehicles. This is to be able to have a more reliable movement of goods. Okay. Another example is frequently the U.S. and the Mexico customs system goes down, impacting the efficient operation of the border crossing, either by shutting them down or reducing their efficiency as we switch to a manual mode. So we need more efficient and reliable systems, to improve the situation.
Great. Very specific, and I appreciate that. Sarah, your thoughts?
Sure. So usually it's a challenge to go last after so many other ideas have been mentioned. But the good thing is that this problem is so huge and so multifaceted that there's still plenty of stuff to talk about. I think to build off of Oscar's point, we're talking about supply chain challenges in general. But we're really talking about a number of different problems, right? So we have some very immediate concerns around congestion at the border or congestion at ports. And then we have some problems that are on sort of the near horizon, right? And I'm thinking about things like the supply of critical minerals that are needed in the EV production process, and where those come from around the world, and what is needed to support this ramp up in electric vehicle production that we are hopefully going to see here in North America. And then I would also sort of just put a finer point on the whole trade policy angle, which is it's important to know what the rules are. It's also important to get the rules right to facilitate this industry transformation. I'm thinking of the EU and Mexico have just upgraded they negotiated an upgrade to their existing FTA, and we think it's important to be able to get agreements like that over the finish line and ratified, because there are, very technical changes that are in the text that sort of help facilitate this transition to electric vehicles. So content rules and trade agreements can be prohibitive to electric vehicle trade. And so this is an area of intense focus for us as we look at what is needed to ramp up production in North America. So I would say, top of mind for us as an area where the U.S. and Mexico, along with their Canadian colleagues, could work closely together, is really looking at that whole EV battery value chain and what makes sense to do, to do what where in North America, given the advantages that each country brings to the table.
Great. So I think in part in answering this question, we've ended up answering a little bit of some of the ones that are to come. But let me get back to you, Sarah, and just ask for a very quick reaction to the question of, the semiconductor lack and lack thereof in terms of shortages and things is something that Ambassador Gutierrez raised already. There's a lot of other things you've raised, other challenges with other inputs. what are ways that Ford is maybe thinking about building some more resilience in its systems, in its supply chain generally? Just as a kind of very general concepts.
Sure. So, actually, a colleague of mine in government affairs, he joked a lot that when he got the call, late last winter, it's like, oh, join a call on this, small issue arising out of Taiwan. And he thought, okay, I'll join this call and the issue will be wrapped up in a week. And it actually turns out that it's the semiconductor chip shortage. And, something that we see persisting well into 2022. And it has been very difficult for the industry. I think the latest estimate I saw by IHS is that it will be 9 million units of vehicles lost this year alone to date. But if there is any silver lining from this experience, is really, causing us to sort of rethink our supply chain management. And really, from an end-to-end perspective. So what do we need to do differently throughout the process? And this really starts way before we do sourcing, right? So making sure that we have, full engineering engagement in the design phase. So, let's look at design from a risk perspective as well. I think, the big issue for the industry on the semiconductor chip shortage is we didn't have a ton of visibility beyond our tier one suppliers. So obviously a big focus of work is, how do we increase transparency and intelligence and get a better look at, what's going on farther down the supply chain. When we do that, we'll have a better understanding of where risks are. So where suppliers are very geographically concentrated in a particular corner of the world, or are we talking about components and technology that only, a handful of suppliers can actually make and deliver to customers? So from there, we can do, sort of more specific supply protection plans. So, whether we're talking about stockpiling or just, greater alignment and technology plan sharing with suppliers so that we can get the capacity and the investment that's needed to support the industry. And obviously too, we're, updating sort of how we scan for risks externally so we can try to identify some of these things earlier in the process. But, one of the things that I think is actually really interesting that we learned with semiconductors is that when we're talking about, technology or components that are shared with other industries that are experiencing demand growth, like consumer electronics, we have to take a completely different sourcing approach and actions to these companies. So, that is something that is also, being reworked as we talk. And I think where it makes sense too, automotive companies are looking at vertical integration and technology independence, and that's behind some of the big announcements you've seen companies make and some of the partnerships. So, this is a work in progress. It'll remain a work in progress, but I think, absolutely critical to the future of the industry as we move into, this next era, and there's just, even more technology integration in the vehicle than there has been to date.
Thank you. Oscar, briefly, what maybe are you most focused on at Lear in terms of supply chain issues at this time? What are your eyes on right now?
The main challenges across the global manufacturing industry and throughout the automotive sector since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic are the semiconductor shortage. The port congestions, raw material scarcity, and also raw material cost increases. So how are we approaching these challenges? As I mentioned earlier, Lear is a global company that operates in multiple countries. We leverage our strengths in operational excellence, supply chain management expertise, and extensive global footprint to address these challenges that we have. And I'm proud on how we've been able to manage through this situation in the past year and a half. We're being very focused on keeping our people safe and minimizing impacts to our customers. So, in some cases, like the semiconductors, there is not much we can do, but we know, we can support by utilizing these strengths that I just mentioned earlier. Okay.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you at this point to just step back a little bit and get back to things we've also somewhat mentioned in terms of the USMCA. Just to hear what, from each of you, what are some of the major implications? You've kind of mentioned, but I want to revisit. How are you thinking about what is, let's just have one major change or one major implication from each of you, from the USMCA, from where you sit. What are they? So I'll start with you again, Sarah, just to give a bit of a different, I stopped with you before, so now I'm going to go around in the other direction.
Sure. So, Ford was very, Ford was supportive of renegotiating NAFTA and the push to modernize the agreement. If you think about the automotive rules in NAFTA, those were really written for the car, the 1980s. So we're in a very different spot now. So we felt, we believed that the rules needed to be updated to reflect the new technology in the vehicle and the technology that would be coming online. We also, we worked really hard to get this agreement over the finish line on Capitol Hill, and so we were very pleased that there was such bipartisan support for the agreement. We feel like that really puts USMCA on a sound footing and provides business with the certainty that they need to continue to invest in the region and to set us up globally to compete with the European Union and our Asian competitors. That being said, the automotive rules of origin in the agreement are the most stringent of any FTA that we know of. So the overall levels are very high, and they also introduce several new elements that make them somewhat complex to deal with on both the labor side and the sourcing of commodities in North America. I think, though, for Ford, given just our massive footprint here in North America and the integration that we have, we're able to work through these new rules together with our suppliers and understand what we all need to do to be compliant. The part of this that is a real challenge, though, is the EV battery front and the fact that there is not enough, production of EV batteries in North America to support all the vehicle plans that we have in the region. And so, under the new rules, it's actually really hard to qualify an electric vehicle if you don't have a battery that's produced in North America. And that's because the battery is such a significant percentage of the overall vehicle's value. So, we are working to line up supply of batteries with our vehicles at the moment. And so that is challenging in the context of USMCA and what the rules are and where we are at this point in time in North America with EV battery supply.
All right. Oscar, anything you wanted to highlight?
Well, kind of a little bit the same. Is the major challenge we see is the increase in the local content. Okay, NAFTA was 62.5%. Now it's 75%. So that's going to be a very significant challenge. But also it's an opportunity. We have to see it also from the other end. This increase will require growth in the industry because more parts will need to be produced in the region. So I think we got to see it from both ends, okay? And I guess the only biggest challenge, which was already mentioned before, I want to just reiterate that, is the fact that it's still unknown, the rule, how it's going to apply. Still open questions about how the local content should be calculated. Okay, so that's, to us, that's the main challenge. We need to make sure that we understand now. At the end, this is a collective automobile industry effort. Okay, and the OEMs are looking to suppliers to help meet these increases, and we, as a company, Lear, we're focused on making sure that we're supporting the customers to meet these increases. So we are also evaluating possibilities of what materials, what components can be can be produced locally, so we can help to improve this local content.
Great. Ambassador Wayne, maybe anything to add in terms of how the countries might work together to build on the USMCA, the structure that it has, and where to go from here?
Sure. So there are at least two phases here. One is rebuilding from the pandemic, and now that the border is opening, how can you grow in the very short term? And a lot of that does have to do with what Oscar was talking about making things work better at the border. We haven't paid any attention to that for 4 years. And we just went through a very difficult time on both sides of the border. So now let's focus again and get that moving really well. Secondly is really understanding your supply chains. I mean, auto companies are taking a much closer look at their supply chains than they did before, and they're going to be intentionally sourcing in those supply chains and planning for the future, and that's true for other industries. Governments, the U.S. and Mexican government have said, we want to help here. Well, they need to understand supply chains, and to be very honest, as someone who worked in the government for 40 years, I could say that we didn't really have a very good understanding of supply chains. So the way we're going to do this is if we have a really thorough, good, frank, and trusting dialogue between the private sector and the public sector. What do supply chains look like? What could be fixed? What can be fixed? And how can you go about doing that? Now that's sort of triple times important as you look to electric vehicles, because you have to have strategies for developing all these things. Sarah mentioned these battery plants. They're going to take 4 or 5 years to build a battery plant. It's not going to happen right away, and it's going to take billions of dollars, and it's going to take it's going to take green and inexpensive energy, because battery plants take a lot of energy. So governments have to think about that. Are they going to have policies that actually encourage green and renewable energy? Are they going to be doing it at affordable costs so that those plants will be able to survive, make money? And then if you have electric vehicles, you have to have electricity at inexpensive prices and other things. There's a lot that has to go along with that, and a lot of infrastructure. So you have to start thinking that through as a company and as a government now, and have a strategy. Should we have a national or a North American battery strategy? Should we have a North American critical mineral strategy? Canada, the United States already said they're going to agree to work on that. But we know that Mexico is taking a different approach, it looks like, to critical minerals. And it looks like Mexico is taking a different approach to electricity generation and green generation, which is going to be something that will have to be worked through. And I'll let Sarah speak to this, but my understanding is that stockholders and companies are giving a lot more attention to ESG factors. Is this a sustainable investment? When we decide where we're going to build a gigantic battery factory, is it going to be green, and will it help us decarbonize our supply chain or not? And I think that needs to be thought about by governments, by both of these governments, as well as by the companies.
Wonderful. Ambassador Gutirez.
Thank you. Just a few additional comments. I really like the subtitle of an article I read in the British paper, The Economist, which said, "The pandemic will not change globalization, but it will reshape it. And it has made supply chains a CEO and board level topic." And I think linking that to USMCA, what are the differences that might be relevant? I would emphasize 2 points. USMCA, as I mentioned, is far from perfect, but it works. I think so. And it has one provision that I'm particularly fond of, which we did not have in NAFTA, which is Chapter 26, a chapter on competitiveness, right? So I think that's an opportunity. And I would urge the industry to sort of make a hostile takeover of that chapter with government and really guide us in terms of what we need to do to build upon NAFTA and get supply chains right among ourselves, among the 3 North American partners. So I think there has been already a meeting of the group that it's created by that Chapter 26. And there are good, intelligent people that are thinking about it. But I think that's an avenue precisely to work that, because if you don't get it, if you don't get good ideas that come from the private sector, and in this case, the industrial sector, into an operational track with government, they take either they don't work, they don't take off, or they take much longer to actually get accomplished. And I think that's an opportunity. The second one that I would mention is labor. One of the valid criticisms, to some extent at least, about NAFTA was that they did not have enough teeth to really assure that labor conditions in Mexico were appropriate, fair, balanced, and I think that there's some truth to that, unquestionably. The USMCA has much more stronger conditions on labor, enforcement of labor conditions and international obligations, something that created uneasiness in Mexico's private sector. It created a specific mechanism to look at cases in which somebody might believe that there is a denial of right of workers, and it started to operate. I think that so far both governments have been managing fairly well that point, and there are some known cases of that mechanism that have already taken place in Mexico. But I want to make the point that I want to make is that I think, it's my humble opinion, that everybody, unions, governments, and the private sector, and especially unions and the private sector, should make sure that that mechanism is centered on the appropriate objective of having good protection of labor rights in Mexico, but that it's also not abused. And I think that if that's the case, it will help. Mexico cannot build its development strategy simply on lower wages, and I think that's absolutely correct. But I would hate to see also that those labor provisions, come up with sort of a, with a vengeance spirit and jeopardize important operations in Mexico. And I think that I'm not saying that is happening. I want to be very clear, but I think it is an important part. It is a new part of the USMCA that can be appropriately guided and can be splendid, but misuse can have very damaging effects on Mexico, at least.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left. So what I will basically do is to ask each one of you, basically this is about opportunities as much as anything else, and it's about collaboration between the two countries and some of the challenges and all that. I'll just ask each one of you for your final thought. Just one main last thing you didn't get to say yet that you would like to share with our audience. So let me start with Oscar, and then I'll go around the rest of you in those last few minutes.
Yes, thank you. Want to stress this, local content increase will drive industry growth in this region. So it will require collaboration of both countries to have the right infrastructure for the effective movement of products. The right systems, the right controls, and incentives in place to support this growth. That's going to be key to make sure that we can support, what is coming ahead of us. There's some other areas like, the shift to electrification. That one is going to change the footprint, bringing significant opportunities for high-tech manufacturing operations. Both countries need to work with school systems to help solve skill gaps in manufacturing. In other words, we need schools to offer specific degrees, graduate specific volume of people required for this transition. You know, it's a tremendous change that is coming, and if both countries are not working together to make this a smooth transition, we're gonna be facing quite a few challenges.
Sarah.
Sure. So, you know, I think we've teed up the next panel well to talk about electrification. I'll just emphasize that again. You know, this is, you know, it needs a regional approach. It needs the private sector and governments to be working together to put together a smart approach to this that's highly competitive with other parts of the world, right? And I think the race is underway. So, you know, we are very engaged in the conversation. We do think it's a big opportunity for all the countries in North America. You know, and then the big piece is obviously investing in the workforce, right? You know, we have that saying in business that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So we can have the best, you know, supply chain strategy, but if we don't have the workforce we need to execute it, then, you know, we're in trouble. So, you know, and I think we do a good job. One of the things I neglected to mention at the outset is we have an engineering center in Mexico. So we have 2,000 engineers down there that are fully integrated into our global vehicle program development and design and engineering. And I think you know, the average age of the engineers we hire down in Mexico is like 25 to 28. So I think, you know, just making sure that we continue to utilize the perspectives of you know, the workers in both countries to our collective advantage, I think is really important. So you know, we're committed to doing our part to continue to invest in our workforce in both locations, and you know, we would like to see the governments do the same.
Great. So with 1 minute each, Ambassador Wayne.
Competitiveness. Go back to what Ambassador Gutierrez said. The competitiveness chapter in USMCA and the parts of the new high-level economic dialogue that get governments talking about how can they retain their global competitiveness by working together. That's key. If people can use those well and dialogue with the private sector and come up with good policies in all the areas that have been mentioned, that'll make a big difference. If it just turns into a bureaucratic get-togethers once in a while and only leaves government talking to government, then we're going to have problems.
Ambassador Gutirez. You are muted.
Very quick comment is, I didn't touch much into this, but in a sense, we'll jump in the next panel. But the future is green, and the future of the auto industry is green, and we need to understand that. And the only way that we can be successful in that context is if we work together, and especially the governments work together. Well,
you could not possibly give me a better segue into introducing the next panel, which will be coming up. I want to thank all of you for this conversation. It was wonderful to hear your perspectives, and I like the optimism that is fundamentally behind much of this conversation. It's stimulating. I appreciate that you shared your insights with everyone here. I want to invite the audience to stay on. The ambassadors will stay with us, and we will have a few more industry participants join us to discuss powering mobility and the implications of the energy transition for the automotive industry. So that will start in exactly 1 minute. And I want to say again, thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon and welcome to panel 2 of our virtual roundtable event. My name is Diana Paez and I lead our work related to mobility here at the William Davidson Institute. I am proudly from Monterrey, Mexico, so it is truly a treat for me to be moderating this panel discussion today. And just like we did for panel 1, we have an impressive lineup of speakers. In this panel, we will be focusing on implications of the energy transition and specifically the rise of vehicle electrification for the U.S.-Mexico automotive industry. Our goal with this discussion is to tease out some of the big themes and opportunities ahead for both countries as we work towards what we hope will be a clean energy future. And first, I would like to welcome back Ambassador Gutierrez and Ambassador Wayne so they can join me on stage while I introduce our 3 industry speakers for this panel. Thank you so much, ambassadors. Welcome back. And I will start by introducing and asking Mike Ramsey to join us on stage.
Hello.
Perfect. Mike Ramsey is a vice president analyst at Gartner. And in this role, Mike covers smart mobility and the evolution of the automotive industry, including digital ecosystems, the rise of vehicle autonomy, connected vehicles, new business models, advanced technologies, and the monetization of connected vehicle data. Before joining Gartner, Mike spent more than a decade in journalism covering the auto industry through its most tumultuous period since the Great Depression. And among other topics, he wrote about the rise of the electric vehicle and vehicle autonomy. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Next, I would like to ask Monica Doher to please join us on stage as well. Monica is the Director General of Mexico's Central Region Automotive Cluster, CLAUS. In this role, she facilitates collaboration among automotive suppliers, academic institutions, and government to support the growth of the industry in Puebla and Tlaxcala, which are 2 Mexican states with significant OEM presence. Prior to this position, Monica served as the Director for International Trade in the state of Puebla and Regional Director of CONACYT, Mexico's National Council on Science and Technology. Monica, it's a pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you to the William Davidson Institute for this invitation.
Thank you. And finally, I would like to ask Scott Adams to please join us on stage. Scott Adams is President e-mobility at Eaton. In this role, Scott is responsible for leading all aspects of the e-mobility business, leveraging expertise from Eaton's electrical and vehicle groups for the development of electrified components and power management technology for automotive and commercial vehicles. Scott joined Eaton in 1994 and has held numerous positions of increasing scope over his 26-year career with the company. Most recently, he was working to develop and execute Eaton's electrification growth strategy. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. We are really thrilled to have all of you here today, and I'm eager to get our discussion started. I think panel 1 set the stage beautifully for us, and I almost wanted to keep everyone and just make this a really large panel discussion to continue talking about electrification and some of those implications that our panelists from the previous discussion were just touching on. So I think it's a perfect moment for us to pick this discussion up, and I would love to ask Mike actually to kick us off by talking a little bit what you do at Gartner, Mike, and especially to give us a sense of the state of the industry right now as it relates to electrification in North America. You know, what are some of those big themes and trends we need to be paying attention to as a North America, integrated region?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Diana, and thanks for having me on. So Mike Ramsey, I'm based in the Detroit area, so not very far from Ann Arbor, and I am the Senior Automotive and Transportation Analyst at Gartner. Gartner, for those of you who don't know, is a technology research and advisory firm. So we have thousands of clients. They work with us to try to get advice on what is happening with technology and what's happening with business. I have seen over the last year, really 12 months, a little bit more than 12 months, a really radical increase in the amount of interest from companies trying to meet environmental sustainability goals. And this is being driven by the top of their organizations. So there's a political element to it, maybe, but I actually think that there's a very strong corporate governance element to this drive to electrification. And this is unusual because one of the things that I have done in meeting with a lot of clients is, I kind of get an idea about what technologies matter to them at that moment. What are they interested in? And I would say that there's really no stronger technology related to transportation than electrification right now, and it's kind of dominated everything else. So we talk to companies about what we think is going to happen, things that they should be doing. And honestly, I try to encourage companies to take aggressive action, to try to meet these sustainability goals. And to set the environment, what's going on globally, North America, to be truthful, is really not a leader in electrification adoption. We're a leader in production of vehicles, which are electrified. We have some of the world leaders there for sure, but our adoption rate is quite slow compared to Europe and China, and there's lots of reasons for that. However, if I had to give a huge theme that is really relevant to this panel, the commitments that have been made to electrify by some of the major car companies, they have a huge implication for capital and manufacturing. Meaning there has been a consulting firm, AlixPartners, their latest tally said that there's been $330 billion of commitment made towards electrification by the major automakers, which is obviously an enormous number. Now, some of that is not new. It's just a conversion of money from that used to have been spent on one technology and now shifted to another. But a lot of it is going to be in the form of battery plants, of which there are going to need to be dozens and dozens and dozens constructed, and new manufacturing facilities. So this is going to have a truly huge effect on the manufacturing environment over the next 10 years, because battery plants, you can't just take an existing plant and make it into a battery plant. They have a lot of needs and requirements that are different than traditional manufacturing, one of them being electricity, which they use at a much higher rate. So I think that the environment that we're going into and in this panel is relevant is that we're going to be entering an era where there's a lot of capital investment made, and where it's made is very relevant. And there are a lot of factors that are not quite the same as they were in the past. And we can talk about that a bit more later as the panel goes on.
Thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, for setting the stage for us. Certainly a lot to unpack and a lot of different directions in which we could take this discussion. So I would like to, think about a little bit of the policy, in a way, some of those implications you touched on, and ask the ambassadors for their perspective as we go through this shift in, that will certainly impact vehicle production. So we were just talking about in panel one about how highly integrated the automotive industry is between Mexico and the US. That's now for internal combustion engine vehicles. But as we think about more production of electric vehicles, what are some of those implications as well, and some of those opportunities perhaps that you see for each country? So I would love to start with Ambassador Gutierrez, if you might just share some of those high-level thoughts as we go through this transition.
Thank you, Diana. To be honest, I feel a little bit, challenged by being talking about this topic, because we have so many good panelists. And as I thought about today's panel, this second panel, I came up with an issue I think I dare put on the table, which is when we talk about electrifications, both for the auto industry and in general, and in the context of North America, I think there's one area of opportunity that I would just put on the table, and it's also related a bit to what Mike Ramsey said about capital, which is it's a little known bilateral institution, the North American Development Bank, who, in my view, was the first green bank ever created. Its headquarters are in San Antonio, Texas, and it was chartered with a mission of helping the United States and Mexico back in the NAFTA days to develop environmental infrastructure. And I bring this subject to the table because I think it's present. Two things have happened. It's grown over the years. It has been, I think it has consolidated as an institution. It's government owned. The U.S. and the Mexican governments own 50% of the stocks, each of them. And I think that it is in a process. It has consolidated. It has recently had its capital increase by governments, and it's right in the process of looking at general to expand its mandate to what is called green infrastructure, and to develop much more projects on precisely mobility, right? And therefore, I think I would dare say that it's a very good opportunity for the bilateral agenda, as a former ambassador, to think about what it can help on in the future, both countries, in terms of doing studies about what needs to be done on battery manufacturing and the like, and also providing, it can do two things, eventually even fund projects at the manufacturing. I think that's precisely where they see it right now. Its board is discussing whether it will allow them for the first time to go, in a sense, a little bit beyond infrastructure and begin to finance, green manufacturing. And I think there's an opportunity there. And also it can probably supply resources to fund the type of studies that sometimes are needed in the context of the binational context to think about the issues that we're discussing today. So let me just put that in the table right now.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Wayne, would you like to comment?
Sure, let me jump in. So we do have a tremendously integrated auto sector right now, and depending on the decisions that governments take going forward, we could see it become less integrated going ahead. If the decisions are made that it's too costly to put battery plants in Mexico, and other people are offering other incentives for it to go elsewhere in North America, if it is too difficult to develop critical minerals, to mine them and process them, and if there is not a commitment to strong recycling for both the waste products there in those, but also coming out of electric batteries, there's a lot of recycling that goes on. You could see a decision by companies to invest in different places. Right now, there's a real interest still in investing in Mexico for a number of reasons. But what you have to have is an alignment among policies, government policies, to make that happen. Now, as I mentioned in the first panel, there are now a number of fora where you could talk about that. There's this competitiveness committee within USMCA, and there's this high-level economic dialogue that has the opportunity for there to be serious government-to-government discussions there. But you really have to be able to have frank and honest discussions about what's going to encourage good development in this new field. And even in the field of, as you move into electric vehicles, as was mentioned by somebody, you're going to need different manufacturing plants, not just for batteries, but you're probably going to see more high-tech plants producing different kind of parts. You're going to need new training of workers, and you will have a technology that probably uses less workers, right? But more highly trained ones. So where you put those, the cost factors can be a big thing. And if the price of electricity, both for the batteries, but for the plants, goes way up, if there's not good infrastructure, if there's a lot of crime on the roads, if you get stuff stuck at the borders, even continuing going forward, it's going to make people think twice about where they make those investments. So there's a lot of serious work for good or for bad that could come out of how well the governments work together and come up with compatible policies, and how well they work with the private sector to really encourage that new investment that's going to have to take place as the auto sector evolves.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. I think you both touched on very key points. And as you were mentioning, Ambassador Wayne, there really, with the rise of electrification, we're talking about a completely new, very different value chain. And so that will definitely have implications for us. I would like to turn to Monica now and hear a little bit about, the perspective from the specifically automotive suppliers in Mexico. So Monica, I know the cluster you lead represents automotive suppliers in the central region of Mexico and also other organizations. Can you please talk to us a little bit about how you're working with these companies right now? Where is the discussion right now when we think about preparing or adapting for this change?
Well, thanks again, Diana. Well, the automotive cluster is a meeting space for the industry here in Puebla and Tlaxcala that is very close to Mexico City. And we have two big OEMs here established, that's Volkswagen and Audi, and about 170 auto parts companies in our region. The cluster facilitates, implements links, collaboration, coordination between companies, academic institutions, and government to promote and to strengthen human, technological, and productive activities in the industry, as well as building conditions for an environment of development for the entire value chain of the region. So with these technologies, as the electric vehicles, the changing consumer preferences and the intensifying regulations such as European countries, US or Canada, which are our main clients, well, are reshaping the automotive industry now and in the years to come. So we have to be really aware of this. Suppliers here in our region, suppliers around the whole country, will have to adapt to respond to the demand for these different components of electric cars. So it means a new challenge for auto parts suppliers. The main systems that are essential for vehicles for internal combustion engines will not be needed for electric vehicles. For example, manufacturers of exhaust systems, fuel systems, transmissions will face a decline in demand as electric vehicles become more common. Assemblers, for example, are already preparing to increase the production of electric vehicles, which will imply the demand for fewer components, while others will remain, of course. Universities, technological institutes will have to prepare new engineers with the necessary competencies to attend these new technologies. The government, of course, will have to give support for companies and universities to be ready for this new demand and for the new services and manufacturing processes.
Yep. Absolutely. So it's certainly a multifaceted, issue here that we will have to be grappling with immediately. Really, truly, I think there is a little bit of perhaps a disconnect when we think about the timing, right? And we talked about how adoption is one side of things, production is another side of things. Thank you so much for mentioning those, Monica. And I will come back to you in a minute. For now, I would love to ask Scott also to talk a little bit about your business, Eaton's business in Mexico. I know that you all have a very strong presence in the country with over 20 plants in different regions, which provide electronic components, some of them to OEMs working and producing, of course, EVs. So could you talk a little bit about, how you work in this integrated fashion and describe some of the changes that you are implementing now as we look at increased demand for EVs, ramping up production, and so forth?
Yeah, sure, Deanna. Thank you. First, I'll just put Eaton in context. We're a large multi-industry global manufacturing company, and we describe ourselves as a power management company. It's all about managing mostly mechanical and electrical power. And it's not just vehicles. I'll come back to vehicles in a minute, but a large part of our business focuses on infrastructure. So we have equipment that goes in power generation, power distribution, and point of use. We make things like uninterruptible power supplies. You might be familiar with those under your desk for your computer, but we also make them for industrial applications like data centers, mission critical applications like hospitals and so forth. So if there's ever a power interruption, we back that power up with batteries and do it with high quality. In terms of the vehicle side of the equation, we have a traditional vehicle business. We're a supplier globally. We make a lot of components for engines and transmissions and drive lines and fuel tanks. But because of our pedigree in an electric power management, as an electric power management company, we also have this e-mobility business that I run. In terms of Mexico specifically, Eaton has over 12,000 teammates employed in Mexico in those over 20 plants that Deanna mentioned. My business specifically, we have 3 plants producing products. They have started traditionally with low voltage products for vehicles, cars, trucks, off-highway, agriculture vehicles. But as we've migrated to more electrification, pure battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, we have developed a portfolio of products that now we are launching in some of our facilities in Mexico, as well as other areas in North America, but Mexico specifically, 2 plants. And those plants, we have made significant capital investments, aligned with some of the comments that were made earlier in the forum. And we have had to train our employees on developing and producing those new products. And certainly, you can appreciate there's higher voltage. If we have to test higher voltage products, that comes with, some also additional training just from a health and safety perspective. So from our view, and particularly my business, we treat North America, we have a great set of teammates across Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, actually, as well. We have great teammates in Mexico, and it's really been a key area for us as we transition to these higher voltage products for our OEM customers and are well on our way to continuing to grow there.
Thank you so much for talking a little bit more about Eaton's business. As you were talking also, I was thinking a little bit about some of the points that were raised before about what it would take specifically to transform, including some of the factories that are now, of course, producing internal combustion engine vehicles for electric vehicles. And I was wondering, Mike, if that is something that you guys are also looking at. And I saw, I believe, a stat or a data point about Ford's plant specifically in Cuautitlán in Mexico, the plant that is, of course, producing the Mach-E electric vehicle. And how I believe it was that plant specifically had to be changed about 80% retooled to be able to produce electric vehicles now. So, does that track with what you've been seeing? Like, it sounds like a really big investment to be able to transition plants now towards the production of electric vehicles. And I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that. You're muted, Mike.
It's the phrase of the century. So in truth, I would say that most vehicles, when you transition from one vehicle model to another, plants they tear out 80% of the equipment in the plant. They reuse a lot, but there's a lot of, when you change over, there's a lot of there's a lot of work that goes into retooling a plant, as they would say. That said, going into an electrified platform, when you are totally switching over, it is a different process. And as Ambassador Wayne said, it opens up the possibility for a lot more automation in the process because there are way fewer components in an electrified vehicle, or an electric vehicle, I should be clear. There are, the powertrain, the exhaust system, as Monica mentioned, there's no transmission, at least not a very complex transmission. It's a way less complex assembly process that is way more likely to use advanced automation capabilities. So a lot of manufacturers are taking this opportunity to not only retool for the new product, but also to try out advanced manufacturing techniques that they might not have done previously, because the complexity is less on the vehicle. It gives them an opportunity to do some things that might have been difficult previously. In addition, some companies like Tesla have done some things that are interesting. It hasn't really taken off much, but I could see it taking off. They've actually developed the vehicle in a way towards the manufacturing. So typically, the manufacturing is adjusted to the vehicle design, but they're starting to turn it around and developing the vehicle design around the manufacturing more to make it more automatable. I think that this has big implications. One, yes, I think that there will be factory walls reused where they take out a lot of the equipment and put in new things. I mean, the walls themselves are honestly the least expensive part of the factory, and there'll be huge renovations in the interior of them. But the I think it's likely that we may see a shortening of supply chains, where you see clusters more, and where we have battery plants and manufacturing facilities put closer together because of the challenges of putting in battery plants and the electricity requirements required for that, and then not wanting to ship long distances these, let's be honest, explosive batteries that are extremely heavy. So I think that we may see some consolidation and the shortening of the supply chain and major capital investments as we change over, and a lot more automation, which clearly has an impact on the workforce, and going forward.
Thank you so much, Mike. The theme of workforce certainly is critical and has come up a few times. And one of the questions we had gotten from the audience was actually to see whether there is, overarching workforce development strategy in place that I'm not aware of. But when we think about that specific topic, yeah, I wonder if, from the policy perspective, Ambassador Wayne and Ambassador Gutierrez, you could chime in, like, what would get us there? How can we even start to approach this topic?
Well, I'm going to start off with a bald pitch for the two studies we've done at the Wilson Center on Workforce Development Cooperation in North America. And basically they point out that there are local examples of good collaboration between the private sector, mainly state or local officials, and local universities and schools, but there's no national policy either in the United States or in Mexico. There is in Canada, and there's no collaboration across North America or between either of the big partners in North America on this. Within USMCA, there is mention of this. There's talks about collaboration on labor within the labor chapter, and it could also fall in the competitiveness chapter. And in the new high-level economic dialogue that the US and Mexico have set up, there's a specific pillar activity that's called Investing in Our People that anticipates starting to work together on workforce development. There are a number of models where this has worked locally in Mexico, around perhaps in Puebla, certainly around Querétaro. It's worked very well, but Puebla has a lot of universities too. A little bit in Guadalajara and the high-tech area, and then in a number of places in the United States, similarly, and then in several places in Canada. And what it's been is state and local officials, local universities, and local companies producing things, getting together and say, what do we need in this trained worker? Can you guys change your courses to develop these kind of workers? And they say yes, and they start doing it. Now, to turn that from a local sort of pilot level into broader national levels will take coordination and work, because we have federal systems in both countries, in all three countries. But it is possible, and it's very important, I think, to have that kind of a dialogue and start expanding these examples.
That's great. Thank you so much. Ambassador Gutierrez, from your perspective, anything to add?
Just very briefly, not much to add on my side. I would mention, I re-emphasize what Ambassador Wayne said about the H-led and the fact that there's a specific chapter there on workforce development and investing on our people. And the blueprint that was put together by the Woodrow Wilson Center is certainly relevant, and that's one. And we had previously some experience, the governments had, and largely with a company of the private sector through the FOBESI and Mosaic programs that, because of their acronyms in Spanish, but that were precisely sort of ways to work together, government and private sectors in innovation and workforce development and universities. And I think the experience to some extent of Salesforce is there, and hopefully the H-led will allow us to move farther. And the other thing is, and this, I'm going to raise an issue that it's always somewhat difficult, but I think that there's a piece to workforce development that is relevant, which is labor mobility. And in the future, I think that we cannot say at this stage that we have sufficient labor mobility or efficient labor mobility between Mexico and the United States to make sure that if we're really going to talk about workforce development in a regional basis, we have the capacity of those, people moving quickly and easily. And there's, that's a very full and a larger discussion about how to do that. But basically, Mexico and the U.S. have strived for since the beginning of the last century to regulate labor mobility. We have had other attempts to do so in the year 2000, and then there have been all sorts of proposals put forward. And I know that it is extremely sensitive issue, and I don't want to minimize that. But I think that that's part of the equation. And if we were going to be serious about labor mobility, about workforce development, probably a lot will have to do also with making sure, with certification and making the sort of certification of education and competencies, really North American, and also making sure that people can move quickly for work purposes.
Thank you so much. Yep. Ambassador Wayne, did you have something? No. Okay. Great. So on that point specifically for workforce development, and I'm glad you were touching on the upskilling, certainly that involves higher education as well. It takes time, right? Aligning the skills that the market needs with the specific education. And I would like to come back to Monica. Just if you could tell us a little bit more about how you work specifically with universities to be able to prepare for this. I know that here in Michigan, there are different initiatives focused on providing EV skills for workers. And I'm wondering how and if this is already part of the conversation in Mexico.
Well, we are really aware that OEMs and suppliers have to face the new challenges that the growing adoption of electric vehicles will bring. Now, millions of Mexican workers are employed in the production of vehicles and auto parts, but technology will change, and the role of employment will also have to adapt to this change. So building an electric car, we know that is less complex than a diesel or a gasoline car. So it requires fewer parts, fewer work responsibility, fewer suppliers. And it's some studies says that it's estimated that approximately 30% fewer man hours will be needed and 50% less space in the factory. So we have to create new competencies. We have to build new competencies in the future labor. That will be required in the different automotive industry companies. Some skills probably we think are cross-domain engineers that will need a little knowledge of mechanical, electrical, electronics to gain competency to designing multidisciplinary technologies. Probably the university have to work more on engineers focus on electric powertrain controls, vehicle mechanics, vehicle architecture, battery engineering, battery management, things like that probably now the universities are not teaching to the students. Mm-hmm. So we have as cluster to foster these new domains and engineering skills, of course.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Monica. And I'm wondering, oh yes, Ambassador Wayne?
Just to add to that those excellent points that Monica made, you also need to look at the critical minerals that you get out of the ground. Mm-hmm. You want to find, can you mine them in a more sustainable way? Can you process them in a more sustainable way, not a dirty way? And then how do you recycle all the things coming out of these electric vehicles in a more sustainable way? So there are engineering questions all along the way, and R&D questions for everybody that's going to be producing this new equipment going forward, and a lot of room for new technologies, and especially when you add this into this sort of mobility, autonomous mobility technology and other kinds of use of artificial intelligence. There's a whole big area for this higher level of technical work and research and development work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those all sound like opportunities to me. And I'm wondering, Scott, if you have something to add just in terms of the, training specifically. I know you said you are training your engineers, and as you go through different processes, are there some additional skills that you're seeing or gaps that you're seeing? How are you guys approaching this at Eaton?
Yeah, I'll go back to something Ambassador Wayne said a few minutes ago. We do engage with local universities, close to our facilities, but it is very local and specific to the region very typically. I'll just say that, yes, we do have development and education needs for our employees, but I have yet to actually see any specific opportunities associated with EVs. So if we have to train and upgrade our workforce from a skills perspective, it really ends up being internal at this point. So I think the discussion is great. I think we would welcome that opportunity, working with public universities and with government organizations as well, if there were those opportunities in place. But admittedly, I'm not familiar with any. So it's really been internal at this point.
Okay. Yep, I understand that. Mike, is there anything else you want to add from what you're seeing generally, across the industry? I think all of the topics or specific themes that Monica mentioned, the ambassadors as well, and Scott, are certainly relevant. There's also cybersecurity that we're, hearing a lot about when we think about, again, EVs and the shift and all of that. Are there others that you think we should be looking at in terms of skill?
I actually think, again, I think Ambassador Wayne and Monica both brought up pieces of this. The auto industry itself is one thing, but the transition to EVs is a clear shift to a different energy source. It has big implications around electricity. I mean, it seems obvious, but there are a lot of different ways to make electricity. Right now we make it typically in one way, but when we start to get to significant numbers of electric vehicles on the road, we almost really don't even know what will happen to our grid and our capability to both produce the batteries, like the battery plants need 3 or 4 times as much electricity as a normal manufacturing plant, but also to charge the cars. So I think that a big area of need for education development is going to be the production of clean electricity, whether it's in solar or wind or nuclear, or we're going to have to reassess that and invest in that area. And secondarily, and picking up on what Ambassador Wayne said, there's right now a massive mining gap for base materials between what we need on a global basis and definitely in North America to produce electric batteries and what we say we will sell. So meaning, if we actually sell as many vehicles as we say we're going to sell, we have nowhere near enough lithium, cobalt, nickel, just in all the mines in the world. Okay, so I think that is a real area that people, if they want to look at other ways of developing the workforce and for economic development, it can't just be in the physical manufacturing of the cars.
Yep.
If I could build on Mike's comments too, just the need, but we don't make batteries, and the power consumption for making batteries is just massive. For any manufacturer, it is extremely important that we have safe, reliable, and consistent energy for our manufacturing plants. We're making significant investments in renewables at our plants, solar panels on our plants, power management, and so forth. So it's come up in some of the discussion, but I can't reinforce enough. Like, for me to be meeting my customers' expectations, the automotive and commercial vehicle OEMs, we absolutely need that safe, reliable, and consistent power that is also cost effective. That is of the utmost importance for any manufacturing operation.
Thank you so much for raising that, Scott. Absolutely, and I think that's certainly in the back of our minds as we think about this transition for Mexico specifically as well. And I wonder if we can bring the ambassadors back with some of your perspective. If we think about some of those conditions that we would need to have in place, both from the policy perspective and the industry perspective, for this shift towards more renewable energy. can you comment a little bit on what you think will be the priorities for both U.S. and Mexico? Ambassador Gutierrez, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, the first point that I must say is that, as all of you know, Mexico is currently in absolutely hot debate about the future of its power industry. And just this week, the bill that was proposed by the president, a constitutional reform, which in my view would be a grave mistake to push forward, was halted for further discussion at the House of Representatives until April of next year. The discussion will continue, but it seems as though the vote that was pending, or at least anticipated in mid-November, would not take place, certainly at that time, and it might go up until next year. And I mentioned this because I think it is going to be it's going to be really impossible, I think, for Mexico to define a national policy in that regard and to begin attracting or reattracting business into Mexico until that gets settled. And even once it gets settled, it'll still take a lot of time to entice again investors and sort of have firms that are involved in the power industry in its different aspects to actually track their plans for the next few years in Mexico. And I think that needs, that's where we start, because renewable energy investments and development has pretty much come to a halt in Mexico. And unfortunately, the level of uncertainty is such that it's hard to see any both Mexican or foreign companies thinking seriously about moving forward into any of the areas that would make sense given what we're talking about. And it's not. I'm not happy to make this comment, but I think that's the objective assessments of where things stand. And until that takes place, I think it'll be very difficult for Mexico to decide, to really have its own blueprint, even furthermore, this North American blueprint for the developing of any manufacturing industry that requires, that it's changing and moving to, like EV, electric vehicles, until that happens. And hopefully, there is going to be a strong debate. The House of Representatives has expressly called for a debate with industry, and I think it would make sense to have the sorts of things that we're discussing about be present in that debate. That's really all I can say, Diana.
Thank you. Diana, if I could follow on to Ambassador Gutirez, just to reinforce some of the points he made. For us, and probably for most companies will say this, when we make investment decisions, we need a degree of certainty. We need to be confident in those decisions, and we make them. I might be making a decision today for an investment that happens a year or two from now. If there's uncertainty on cost, uncertainty on availability of our inputs, in this case, as we're talking about energy, and we have other options that have more certainty, we tend to go with the more certainty. Or if we just have uncertainty, maybe we won't make the decision, we won't make the investment. So I think, just piggybacking on the comment, I don't have a judgment on how to do that. I'll leave that to others, but just from a decision-making perspective, that certainty and that clarity and confidence that our business plans and our capital investments will get the appropriate returns for our employees and shareholders and so forth, that it really is a big influence as we make investment decisions.
Absolutely, Scott. It makes business sense. Ambassador Wayne, please.
Well, only to add, of course, it's the government of Mexico's place to make these decisions, but they do need to make it understanding what the impact of it is going to be. And so you may have seen there was a recent draft report that came out of a U.S. Research facility that belongs to is part of the autonomous part of the U.S. government. And their estimate looking at this reform was that carbon emissions would increase between 26 and 65%, and electricity generation costs would go up 32 to 54% if this reform passes as it's currently written. The president of Mexico specifically complained about this report in his press conference in the morning, and the report is now getting peer review. It has not been released, but anything like that with any serious analysts looking at this, that just needs to be debated, because it's going to have widespread effect in Mexico and for Mexico's future prosperity, as well as for investment decisions of both Mexican companies and international companies going forward. And Mexico just deserves an open and frank debate about the facts, and a forward-looking debate about what lies ahead.
Thank you so much. Monica, is there anything you want to add in this particular point, based on the perspective you were seeing this day to day, in terms of, the conditions that we hope to see or we will need to see in Mexico for this future?
Well, yeah, to attract investments, foreign investment, national investment, of course, we need certainty, as the ambassador said, but also we need a market. And I think the market, we have it. We have United States, the European Union. We have also the skills in Mexico. Of course, we have to prepare more the people for the new coming technologies. But we have infrastructure, we have commodities, we have trade areas. So I think we have a lot of things that will help to foster these investments. However, we have to be competitive in energy costs, for example. So if this reform passes, I think it will be more difficult for the Mexican companies that are established here to compete globally.
Yep. Thank you, Monica. And that's a perfect segue into my next question for all of you. And I would like to start with Mike on this. So we were talking about, just now, Monica, you mentioned compete globally, right? And Mike, as you mentioned at the beginning in your intro remarks, in North America, we're not nearly as competitive as in terms of adoption, for example, for EV, we're talking about China and about Europe and other markets. So if you all could think about and share with us, what are the areas that you see as being top priority for us to focus on next, so that we can compete globally as an integrated North American region, assuming that these conditions are in place? And I would love to start with Mike.
Well, if you look at, and I'm being realistic, I think it's going to be difficult in North America to match what certain things have been done in China and Europe. But if you look at what they've done, and the places where adoption of EVs is high, they don't just use incentives, they use disincentives, right? So I think that there needs to be a collection, or people need to think, we can't just give people money to buy EVs or make them cheaper. You also have to disincentivize the other technology if you want to actually make ground. And that is a big political decision and it requires political will. But if you look in China, there's a very big disincentive to own a gasoline vehicle versus an EV. It's the same in Europe. They're basically punishing you in some ways. It's a difficult political one, but if you wanted to catch the rest of the crew or the rest of the world that is leading in adoption, it has to be the carrot and the stick for moving towards EVs.
Thank you, Mike. And ambassadors, if you think about some of those areas that we should focus on next, from the policy perspective, what do you think those would be, so that we can better compete globally? Ambassador Nguyen, would you like to chime in?
You mean in general or in the electric vehicle?
Yeah, as we think about electrification. Yes, specifically.
Well, you have to take steps within your own marketplace to get people to start to encourage people to use this. There has to be massive investment, for example, in charging stations. And how are you going to incentivize that? Right now, you have, certain local initiatives or state initiatives that have incentivized it, and you have private companies that are putting in their parking areas and this and stuff. But if you have a gigantic interstate highway system, who's going to invest to put electricity chargers at all the stops along the way? So you have to make decisions of how you're going to pay for that going forward. And I think that's a big decision. There's, of course, some of that in this bill that's being, or there may be some of it in this bill that's being discussed in the U.S. Congress. Who knows what will emerge in this bill, if it comes out or not. But you do need that kind of very substantial infrastructure development, as well as policies, as Mike said, I agree, that incentivize people to buy this and make it a bit more costly, especially in certain areas. As we've seen in Europe, some of the steps in Europe are disincentivizing in very congested areas your carbon output to those areas. So there are a lot of ways you could go about this, but you do have to start doing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So in terms of making that policy decision or those conditions as well, Ambassador Gutierrez, anything else you want to add for the Mexico side of things in terms of those areas we can and should focus on to be more competitive as we change towards electric vehicle production?
No, to be honest, Dan, I don't have the answer, but what I do believe is that the Mexican government should, as Ambassador Way was saying, should be, we should have a very fact-based debate about if we're willing to do what it takes to precisely achieve what we have been talking about today, efficiency in supply chains and an edge in everything that involves the change in, on the electricity or on the power industry. And that has not happened yet. And I'm afraid that the debate is very much obscured by ideology, unfortunately, rather than fact. And Ambassador Wayne was very careful in saying it is up to the Mexican government to decide what to do, obviously. But I think that, you can't have your cake and eat it. We can't be talking about, as I would say this as a Mexican, we can't be talking about wanting to move forward in strengthening our supply chains, in continue in a sort of integrating with our neighbors, the United States, and doing the sorts of things that are needed in terms of the power industry changes that we're seeing, but then just not have the right narrative, but then actually not doing anything about it. And I would say if there's something to do first, is precisely to have that debate. And I think we should not shy away about, there's nobody better to think about competitiveness than the private sector, in my view. And therefore, we need to listen. Government should listen to them. And I dare to say that both governments are not necessarily listening as much as they should to private sector right now. And that is why we've emphasized throughout these whole panels the issue of the H-LED and the Chapter 26, because those were created specifically with the idea of have this sort of engagement with the private sector.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Monica, anything you want to add in terms of, what you in the private sector need specifically from, in Mexico right now?
Yeah, well, I think we have to raise awareness that the different actors, government, academic, firms, that we all have to prepare to face the challenges that the growing adoption of electric vehicles will bring. We have to be preparing from now on, not from in 5 years from now on. We have to start today. On the other hand, I think we have to generate new suppliers to avoid shortage and create a strong supply chain to compete in North American region. I think also that it's very important that the OEMs help prepare their supply chain for the future to maintain their places as value partners in the changing world. So I think it's a work of not only one actor, we all have to be part of it, the universities, the government, and of course the firms.
Thank you so much. Scott, any last word to add from the industry perspective before we wrap up?
Sure, just a quick comment. The only thing I'd add to the great comments from the forum here is cost. You know, anything we can do to get cost out of the system and waste. By that I mean waste. You know, Mike talked about kind of the push and pull of incentives and regulatory associated, you know, or penalties. And Ambassador Wayne talked about charging infrastructure. If you can get an EV that costs less than an internal combustion engine vehicle, and you're confident you can charge it, you'll buy it all day long. You know, so so the cost would be really the thing I'd add. Anything we can do to really not put waste in the system, get cost out, really helps drive the adoption.
Thank you so much. We are almost at time, and I really want to thank our wonderful speakers from your time today and for such an engaging discussion and sharing your insights. And thank you everyone for joining us. The recording of this event will be available on our website soon. We really look forward to more opportunities to continue the conversation in the future. And on behalf of the William Davidson Institute and our partners, thank you so much for making the time. Thank you.